The storm had rolled through in the night, leaving the coastline of Storm Haven transformed. Where the day before there had been soft dunes and a gentle slope of shore, now the beach was scattered with the wreckage of the sea's restless mood. Tangled ropes lay half buried in sand. Jagged boards crusted with barnacles were strewn along the waterline. Clumps of seaweed clung to the edges of tide pools that shimmered in the pale morning light. The air hung heavy with the scent of salt and brine, layered with something deeper, an earthy musk released from the sand and stones by the churn of the waves. Above, the sky still wore the remnants of the storm, a quilt of dull gray clouds streaked with the pale gold where the sun tried to push through. Nathan Hayes walked slowly, his boots sinking into the damp sand with a soft sucking sound at each step. The weight of his weathered canvas coat settled comfortably on his shoulders, and his wide-brimmed hat shielded his eyes from the erratic glare of the morning. At 58, his body still held the straight-back discipline of his years in the Marine Corps, though time had etched deep lines around his eyes and salted his beard with gray. He had been out here more times than he could count, in every season and every kind of weather. The sea was as much a part of him as his own blood, and he knew the character of this stretch of coast better than most men knew the inside of their own homes. Today his purpose was simple, to check the traps he'd set 2 days before, to see what the storm had taken and what it had given back. His eyes scanned the shoreline with the practiced gaze of someone who could spot a glint of fish scale in a tangle of kelp or the faint ripple of a crab beneath the surface. The first trap was exactly where he'd left it, though half buried now in wet sand. Nathan crouched, his knees protesting with a dull ache that he ignored, and began to dig it out. The wooden slats were intact, the mesh wire still taut. Inside, 3 decent-sized crabs scuttled against the walls of their temporary prison. He nodded in satisfaction. Not a bad haul, considering the weather. As he worked his way down the beach, checking each trap in turn, the town of Stormhaven gradually came to life behind him. Lights winked on in the weathered clapboard houses that clustered along the harbor. The distant sound of a boat engine sputtered and caught. This had been a fishing town for over 200 years, though these days it was more ghosts than glory. The younger generation had mostly left for Boston or Portland, seeking fortunes that the dwindling fish stocks could no longer provide. What remained was a community of stubborn holdouts, mostly men and women of Nathan's generation or older, who couldn't imagine life away from the rhythms of the tide and the smell of the salt air. A snapshot of America that was slowly fading from the picture. The last trap was set farther out, near where Black Rock Point jutted into the sea like the prow of a stone ship. It was a spot known for its dangerous currents, but also for the abundance of larger crabs that gathered in the shadows of the rocks. Nathan made his way carefully along the shore, noting how the storm surge had flattened the dune grass and left streaks of foam high on the sand. The gulls were back already, wheeling overhead, their cries sharp and impatient as they fought over the scraps the sea had thrown ashore. Nathan barely paid them mind. Gulls were constant companions here, and their noisy arguments were part of the rhythm of the place. It wasn't until he rounded the low, rocky outcrop that something broke that rhythm. At first, he thought it was just another piece of debris, maybe a length of anchor chain torn free from some wreck offshore. But as his eyes narrowed, the sight fixed itself in his mind. A thick iron link, half buried in the sand, glistening faintly beneath a smear of wet seaweed. The metal was dark with rust, but here and there the storm had scrubbed it clean enough to catch the weak light, and it gleamed in a way that was almost beckoning. The link was big, thick as his wrist, and from it another disappeared into the sand in a slow, deliberate curve, as though the beach itself were trying to keep it hidden. Nathan slowed his step without realizing it. The sound of the waves seemed to soften. The chatter of the gulls faded into the background. He glanced around, half expecting to see someone else nearby, but the beach in this early hour was empty. He stood for a moment, hands resting on his hips, gazing down at the chain. A strange tightness settled in his chest. Not fear exactly, but something near to it. A wariness he'd learned to trust after years on the water. That wariness told him to keep walking, to leave the thing be. But another part of him, the part that had followed flickers of silver in the water at midnight, or taken his boat farther out than he'd meant to go, urged him closer. As he stepped toward it, the wet sand darkening under his boots, Something caught his eye, a faint blue glow in the water near the chain, like foxfire or phosphorescence, but brighter, more concentrated. It disappeared the moment he moved to touch the water, leaving him wondering if he'd imagined it. Nathan crouched down. Up close, the link's surface was rough with pits and flakes, the corrosion of long years in salt water. Small barnacles clung to its edges, and a faint green stain marked where seaweed had wrapped around it. It looked ancient, yet the metal underneath the rust had a strange quality to it. Not like ordinary steel, but something denser, more purposeful. He reached out without thinking and laid his palm against the cold metal. The chill of it went straight into his skin, down into his bones. For a moment, he thought he felt a tremor run through it, a subtle vibration that could have been the sea's movement, or could have been something else entirely. That's when he noticed the markings, faint but unmistakable. Near where the link joined to the next, a series of symbols had been stamped into the metal. Not random scratches, but deliberate patterns. One looked like the eagle insignia of the U.S. Navy, but the others were unfamiliar. Triangular shapes interspersed with straight lines. They had a purpose, a meaning. Though what that meaning might be, Nathan couldn't guess. The sand around the link was loose from the tide's retreat, grains trickling away to reveal a little more of the curve beneath. Nathan frowned. If the storm had uncovered this much, what else might lie buried here? He glanced again up and down the beach. No one. The distant rocks to the north rose like dark teeth, and to the south the shore bent away until it vanished into mist. He shifted his grip and tugged experimentally at the chain. It resisted at first, then shifted a fraction with a gritty sound, like something stirring in its sleep. He let go, standing again, brushing the damp grit from his hands. The sensible thing was to come back later, maybe with tools, maybe with help. But as he stepped back, he found himself staring at it still, caught by the way it seemed to vanish so completely into the sand, as though it didn't just end somewhere beneath, but went on, deeper than he could imagine. Taking out his phone, he marked the GPS coordinates and snapped several photos of the chain and its surroundings. He hesitated over the last picture, zooming in on the strange symbols, then pocketed the device and turned back toward town. His traps could wait. Whatever was under that sand wasn't going anywhere, but it wasn't going to let him go either. By the time he reached the edge of the rocks, he had already decided he would come back soon, maybe later today. He would see how much of it he could pull free, just enough to know what it was. But for now, he let the sound of the tide fill his ears again, the hiss and crash of water on sand, the whispers that seemed to rise and fall with each wave. When he finally looked back one last time, the light had shifted again. The chain almost lost against the darkening sand, but he could still see it. A shape and a shadow that didn't belong. Waiting. The thought of the chain refused to loosen its hold on Nathan's mind. Even as he walked away from it that morning, its image kept returning, stubborn and unshakable. He had seen countless strange things on this beach. Half-rotted crates tangled in weed, old nets so heavy with sand they seemed woven from stone, even the occasional relic from ships long forgotten. But nothing had ever settled into him like that length of iron, thick and cold beneath his hand. The harbor was coming fully awake by the time he returned to the docks. The air smelled of diesel and coffee, of fish and frying bacon. A few of the bigger boats were already heading out, pushing through the breakwater toward the open sea. Nathan nodded to the men he knew, which was most of them, and made his way to the weathered building that housed Anchor's Rest, the only place in Stormhaven that served a decent breakfast. Inside, the cafe was warm and loud with conversation. The walls were lined with faded photographs of boats and crews from decades past, interspersed with mounted trophy fish and nautical equipment too worn for use but too meaningful to discard. A long counter stretched along one wall, behind which Marge O'Donnell had been serving coffee for as long as anyone could remember. "Mornin', Nathan," she called, already reaching for a mug. "The usual?" He nodded, taking a seat at the counter. Most of the tables were filled with the morning crowd, fishermen heading out or coming in, a few townspeople, the occasional early tourist. Nathan preferred the counter, where he could sit with his back to the room and face the harbor through the salt-streaked windows. "Storm do any damage to your place?" Marge asked, sliding a steaming mug in front of him. "Nothing serious. Lost a few shingles, that's about it." "Lucky," Bill Mathers had half his roof torn off, and the old pier by the fish market collapsed entirely. Nathan grunted in acknowledgement but didn't pursue the conversation. His mind was still out there on the beach with that chain. He sipped his coffee, its familiar bitterness anchoring him to the present moment. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Marge said, her eyes sharp beneath her gray curls. "One of those mornings, is it?" Nathan gave her a half smile. Marge had known him since he came back from the Gulf War, had watched him build his life here, had served him coffee the morning after his wife's funeral. She could read the moods of the men who frequented her cafe the way they read the weather. "Found something strange out by Black Rock Point," he said finally. "Old chain buried in the sand. Big links. Markings on it I've never seen before." "Probably off some wreck," she said, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Curiosity, or maybe concern. Maybe. He didn't tell her about the strange blue light in the water, or the way the chain had seemed to vibrate under his touch. Some things sounded too much like fishermen's tall tales, even to other fishermen. He finished his breakfast quickly, paid, and headed back out into the salt air. His house stood a quarter-mile from the harbor, up on a low bluff that gave it a view of the sea even in the worst weather. It was a simple structure, cedar shingles weathered to a soft gray, white trim around the windows, a small porch facing the water. Nathan had built most of it himself after returning from service, adding to the original structure that had been in his family for generations. Inside, the house was neat but lived in. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a wood stove that provided heat in the winter. A few pieces of sturdy furniture, bookshelves filled with volumes on maritime history and fishing, and a collection of framed photographs, mostly of his late wife Margaret, their son James. The walls held mounted keepsakes from Nathan's time in the Marines, including his Purple Heart and a faded unit photo from Desert Storm. Nathan hung his coat by the door and went straight to the back room. It had once been his grandfather's study and still held the old oak desk and filing cabinet John Hayes had used until his death 20 years ago. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, though his grandfather had been gone long enough that the scent was more memory than reality now. The bottom drawer of the filing cabinet was where Nathan kept the family papers, birth certificates, his parents' marriage license, the deed to the house. But beneath those orderly documents was a battered metal box that had belonged to his grandfather. Nathan had looked through it only a few times over the years, mostly after his grandfather's death, when he was sorting through the old man's belongings. He pulled it out now and set it on the desk, wiping a thin layer of dust from the top. The latch was stiff but opened with a firm push. Inside were his grandfather's military papers, discharge documents, letters of commendation, a few medals in tarnished boxes. John Hayes had served in the Navy during World War II, though he rarely spoke of it in detail. "Just did my part," he would say whenever the subject came up, then change the conversation. Nathan lifted out the stack of papers and set them aside. Beneath was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age, and a manila envelope containing photographs. He opened the envelope first and carefully slid the black and white images onto the desk. Most were familiar. His grandfather with shipmates, posed on the deck of a vessel, or in port somewhere in the Pacific. But one photo near the bottom of the stack caught his eye. It showed John Hayes standing next to what appeared to be a submarine, but not one Nathan recognized from his knowledge of WWII vessels. This one had strange protrusions along its hull and an unusual conning tower. More interesting was the group of men standing with his grandfather, some in Navy uniform, others in civilian clothes, with the unmistakable look of scientists or engineers. Nathan turned the photo over. On the back, written in his grandfather's neat hand, Unit 616, Poseidon Team, 1945. The journal was next. Nathan had glanced through it years ago, but had found it disappointingly vague. Mostly daily weather observations, brief notes about naval operations that revealed little, and occasional personal reflections on missing home. Now, though, he looked at it with new eyes, slowly turning the pages. He noticed something he had overlooked before. Several pages had been neatly cut out, leaving only thin strips near the binding. The entries jumped from March 1945 to June, with no explanation for the gap. And after that point, the writing changed. Less detailed, more circumspect, as if his grandfather had suddenly become aware that someone might read his words. Near the back of the journal, a loose sheet of paper fell out. A sketch, done in pencil, of symbols that looked eerily similar to those Nathan had seen on the chain that morning. Below the drawing, his grandfather had written, "What's in compartment 7 must never surface." Nathan sat back in the chair, the pieces starting to connect in his mind. His grandfather had been involved in something classified, something called Poseidon, involving a submarine and possibly related to whatever lay buried off Black Rock Point. The storm had uncovered a piece of history that had been deliberately hidden for nearly 80 years. He checked his watch. Almost noon. The tide would be at its lowest around 2 o'clock, the perfect time to go back and take a closer look at that chain. But first, he needed to talk to someone who might help make sense of what he'd found. So, the Storm Haven Maritime Museum occupied what had once been the harbor master's office, a 2-story brick building at the edge of the wharf. Its exhibits were modest, displays of fishing equipment through the ages, models of famous vessels, artifacts recovered from local shipwrecks. But what made it special was its curator, Frank Sullivan. Frank was sitting behind the reception desk when Nathan entered, his prosthetic leg propped up on a stool, a magnifying glass in one hand, as he examined what looked like an old brass compass. At 72, his face was deeply lined, his white hair still cut in the military style he'd maintained since his Navy SEAL days. He looked up as the bell above the door jingled, and his weathered face broke into a grin. "Nathan Hayes, haven't seen you in here for months. Don't tell me you've suddenly developed an interest in culture." Nathan smiled. He and Frank had been friends for nearly 30 years, bonded by their military service, and a shared understanding of what it meant to come home changed by what they'd seen and done. "Need your expertise, Frank. Got a minute?" Frank set down the compass and gestured to the chair across from him. "Museum's empty, as usual. What's on your mind?" Nathan took out his phone and pulled up the photos of the chain, passing it over. "Found this on the beach near Black Rock Point this morning. Storm must have uncovered it." Frank's expression changed as he studied the images, the humor leaving his eyes. He zoomed in on the markings, his brow furrowing. "Where exactly did you find this?" Nathan described the location in detail. Frank nodded slowly, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm on the desk. "You're sure it was secured to something, not just a piece of debris?" "Positive. Couldn't move it more than an inch or two, like it's anchoring something heavy." Frank handed the phone back, his face serious now. "Those markings, the Eagle is naval intelligence, circa World War II. The others," he hesitated. "I've seen something similar before on documents related to classified recovery operations." "Recovery of what?" Frank glanced toward the museum entrance, though they were still alone. After the war, there were special units tasked with securing certain assets, enemy technology, scientific research, sometimes entire vessels. Most of it was documented, brought to the U.S. for study. But some things, he shook his head. Some things were deemed too sensitive. They disappeared from the records. Nathan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "You think this chain is connected to one of those operations?" "I think," Frank said carefully, "that you may have stumbled onto something that was never meant to be found." He leaned forward. "Did you tell anyone else about this?" "Just mentioned finding an old chain to Marge at the cafe. Nothing specific." "Good. Keep it that way, for now." Frank stood, reaching for the cane he used on days when his prosthetic bothered him. "Let me lock up, and we'll go take a proper look at this thing." As Frank secured the museum, Nathan noticed his friend moving with a controlled urgency he hadn't seen in years. Whatever the chain represented, it had stirred something in the old SEAL, something that looked like a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Outside, Frank paused to look out at the harbor. "Your grandfather was Navy, wasn't he? World War II? "Yeah, found something of his this morning that might be connected. Journal entries, a photo with Unit 616 and Poseidon team written on it." Frank's head snapped around, his eyes sharp. "Poseidon? You're sure about that name?" "That's what it said. Means something to you?" Frank was silent for a long moment, watching a fishing boat make its way past the breakwater. "There were rumors back when I was active. Whispers about a project from the war years, something so classified that most of the records were destroyed afterward. Operation Poseidon, they called it. What was it about? Nobody knew for sure. Something to do with advanced German technology captured in the final days of the war. Frank's voice dropped lower. The kind of technology that could change the balance of power if it fell into the wrong hands. Nathan thought of his grandfather's cryptic note. What's in compartment 7 must never surface. I need to see this chain, Frank said, straightening his shoulders with the determination that had once made him a legendary instructor at WWII. And then we need to talk to Eleanor Wright. The history professor? Former professor. Eleanor's husband was naval intelligence. After he died, she spent 30 years researching classified operations from the war. If anyone can help us make sense of this, it's her. As they walked toward Nathan's truck, Frank added, one more thing. If this is what I think it is, we might not be the only ones interested. The government has a long memory when it comes to its secrets, and there are still people whose job it is to make sure certain things stay buried. Nathan nodded, understanding the warning. He had spent enough time in the military to know that some secrets came with guardians, and those guardians didn't always ask politely before taking action. The tide was still ebbing when they reached Black Rock Point. The beach stretched wider now, exposing areas that had been underwater earlier. The chain was exactly where Nathan had left it, though more of it was visible, the retreating water and shifting sands having stripped away another layer of concealment. Frank stood looking at it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he knelt with some difficulty and ran his fingers over the links. Special steel alloy, he murmured, designed to resist corrosion. This isn't standard Navy issue. This was custom made for whatever it's holding down. Nathan had brought tools this time, a shovel, heavy gloves, and a length of rope. He began to dig around the exposed links, clearing away the wet sand to reveal more of the chain's path. It angled toward the water, disappearing under the surface about 20 feet out. It's heading toward the rocks, Frank observed, pointing to where Black Rock Point jutted into the sea. The underwater topography out there is tricky. Deep channels, hidden caves. If someone wanted to secure something away from prying eyes, that would be the place to do it. They worked methodically, exposing more of the chain. Every few links, they found the same strange markings, the Navy insignia and the geometric patterns. Frank photographed each one, his movements precise and professional. These aren't just identification marks, he said after examining several. They're a code. See how the patterns change slightly? It's a sequence. Nathan saw it now, subtle variations in the arrangement of triangles and lines, progressing in an orderly pattern from one link to the next. Like a combination lock, he suggested. Or coordinates, Frank countered, or both. As they cleared more sand, Nathan noticed something else. Small numbers stamped into the underside of each link, nearly invisible unless you were looking for them. 731, he read aloud. Same on each one, I can see. Frank's head came up sharply. 731? You're sure? Clear as day. What does it mean? Frank sat back on his heels, his face suddenly pale beneath its weathered tan. U-731, it was a German submarine, one that officially never existed, a prototype rumored to have been built in the final year of the war. How do you know about it if it never officially existed? Because, Frank said quietly, my first commanding officer was obsessed with finding it. Captain Richardson, later Admiral Richardson. He believed U-731 was carrying something revolutionary, a weapon or technology that could have changed the course of the war if the Germans had deployed it sooner. The name triggered something in Nathan's memory. Richardson, wasn't he the one who left my team to die in Vietnam? The very same. Frank's voice had hardened. He sacrificed 4 good men for what he claimed was the greater good. Never forgave him for that, never will. Nathan knew better than to pursue that line of conversation. Frank's experience in Vietnam was a wound that had never fully healed, and Richardson's name was salt in that wound. They continued working until they had exposed about 30 feet of chain, enough to confirm that it led directly toward the underwater formations at the base of Black Rock Point. By then, the tide had begun to turn, water slowly reclaiming the beach. We'll need diving gear to see where it goes from here, Frank said, standing with a grimace as his artificial leg adjusted to his weight. And more hands. This is bigger than just the 2 of us now. Nathan nodded, coiling the rope he'd brought. They hadn't needed it yet, but he had a feeling they would soon. Eleanor Wright, you said? She lives up on Lighthouse Road, keeps to herself these days, but she'll see us if I call ahead. Frank looked out at the water, where the chain disappeared beneath the surface. Nathan, if this really is connected to U731, we might be opening a very old door that was locked for good reason. My grandfather was part of whatever this was, Nathan replied, his voice firm. If there's something down there that he helped hide, I need to know what it is. Why it was important enough to keep secret all these years. Frank studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, but we do this carefully. No loose talk in town, no bringing in people we don't trust completely. He glanced at his watch. Let's go see Eleanor. She keeps early hours, likes to be in bed by sunset. As they walked back to the truck, Nathan felt a strange sensation, as if they were being watched. He turned to scan the dunes and the edge of the tree but saw nothing unusual. Still, the feeling persisted, a prickle at the back of his neck that he had learned to trust in combat zones. Some instinct made him look back at the water one last time. There, just beyond where the chain vanished beneath the waves, he caught a glimpse of that same blue luminescence he'd seen earlier, a soft, pulsing glow that seemed to hover just below the surface, before fading away like a closing eye. Frank had seen it too. He stood frozen, staring at the spot where the light had been. Tell me you saw that, Nathan said quietly. I saw it. Frank's voice was tight. That's not bioluminescence. That's not any natural phenomenon I've ever seen. What is it then? Frank shook his head slowly. I don't know, but whatever's down there, it's still active. After 80 years, it's still active. The drive back to town was silent, both men lost in their own thoughts. Nathan's mind kept returning to his grandfather's warning, what's in compartment 7 must never surface. For the first time, he wondered if they should heed that warning, if some secrets were better left undisturbed. But then he thought of John Hayes, the quiet, principled man who had taught him to fish, to navigate by the stars, to respect the sea but never fear it. His grandfather had left those clues for a reason, perhaps not as a warning, but as a message in a bottle, sent forward through time until someone was ready to receive it. That someone was Nathan, and whatever lay at the end of that chain, he was determined to find it. Dr. Eleanor Wright lived in a Victorian house perched on the highest point of Lighthouse Road, with a commanding view of the bay and the open ocean beyond. The house itself seemed frozen in time. White clapboard with black shutters, a wraparound porch furnished with wicker chairs, gardens that had once been meticulously maintained, but now grew with a controlled wildness. Frank had called ahead, and Eleanor was waiting for them on the porch when they arrived. At 65, she remained a striking woman, tall and straight-backed, with silver hair cut in a practical bob and keen eyes behind tortoiseshell glasses. She wore khaki pants and a blue Oxford shirt, as if she might be called to give a lecture at any moment. Frank Sullivan, she said as they climbed the steps, her voice warm with genuine pleasure. It's been too long. Her gaze shifted to Nathan. And Nathan Hayes. I don't believe we've been formally introduced, though I certainly know who you are. Nathan shook her offered hand. Ma'am. Eleanor, please. Ma'am makes me feel like I should be rocking on this porch and complaining about my arthritis. She gestured to the chairs. Sit. I've made iced tea. Though from the tone of Frank's call, I suspect we might need something stronger before this conversation is done. Once they were settled, Frank wasted no time. He showed Eleanor the photos of the chain and explained where they had found it, including the connection to U731 and Operation Poseidon. Eleanor listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When Frank mentioned the blue light in the water, she set down her glass with a sharp click against the table. Show me the symbols again, she said, holding out her hand for the phone. She studied the images intently, occasionally nodding to herself. What my late husband would give to see this, she murmured. He spent years trying to piece together the Poseidon files. So it was real, Frank said, not just rumors. Oh, it was real, highly compartmentalized, even within naval intelligence. Charles, my husband, only learned about it by accident when he was researching something else entirely. She handed the phone back to Frank. What you found appears to be part of a containment system designed to secure something underwater for an indefinite period. The U-boat? Nathan asked. Eleanor shook her head. Not the submarine itself, something it was carrying. She rose and crossed to the porch railing, looking out at the sea. Are either of you familiar with Operation Paperclip? Both men nodded. It was the program that had brought German scientists to America after the war. Men like Werner von Braun, who had built the V-2 rockets for Hitler and later helped NASA reach the moon. Paperclip was the public face of a much broader effort, Eleanor continued. The race to capture German technology before the Soviets could get it. Most of what we recovered was brought back to the U.S., studied, adapted for our own use. But there were exceptions. She turned back to face them. Charles believed that in the final months of the war, a specialized U-boat, likely your U-731, was dispatched from Germany with particularly sensitive cargo. Not just scientists or documents, but actual prototype technology. It was intercepted by the U.S. Navy off the East Coast. And instead of bringing it to shore, they secured it here, Frank said. Exactly. The decision would have been made at the highest levels. Whatever was on that submarine was deemed too advanced, too dangerous, or too politically sensitive to be officially acknowledged. Nathan thought of his grandfather's involvement. My grandfather was part of Unit 16, the Poseidon team. He left clues about it, but never spoke of it directly. Eleanor nodded. The men involved would have been sworn to absolute secrecy. Many took what they knew to their graves. She paused. Nathan, if your grandfather left clues, it may have been because he had misgivings about the operation. Not everyone agreed with the decision to bury certain technologies. What kind of technology are we talking about? Frank asked. That's the million-dollar question. Eleanor returned to her seat, leaning forward intently. The rumors Charles tracked down pointed to advanced energy research, something beyond nuclear fission, possibly even cold fusion. The Germans had some brilliant physicists who were exploring theoretical concepts decades ahead of their time. Why hide it then? Nathan asked. If it was that revolutionary, why not develop it? Fear, Eleanor said simply. Fear of what might happen if such technology became widely known. Fear of how it might be weaponized. Fear of disrupting the existing power structures. She smiled grimly. Never underestimate the human capacity to fear progress, especially when that progress threatens the status quo. Frank shifted in his chair, his expression troubled. If this technology was so important, the government would have kept tabs on it. There might still be surveillance, monitoring systems. Almost certainly, Eleanor agreed, which means your activities have likely already been noticed. As if on cue, Nathan's phone rang. The screen showed an unfamiliar number. He hesitated, then answered, putting it on speaker. Dad? The voice was clear but tense. It's James. Nathan straightened in surprise. He hadn't spoken to his son in nearly 3 months. James, everything okay? I just got a strange call from Tom Whitaker back home. Said you were digging up some old chain on the beach, asking questions about military operations from World War II. Nathan shot Frank a look. News traveled fast in small towns, despite their best efforts at discretion. I'm fine, James. Just found something interesting, that's all. Dad, listen to me. James's voice dropped lower. I work for Meridian Defense now. We have contracts with several government agencies. I've heard things. If you've found what I think you have, you need to be careful. What do you know about this? Nathan demanded, a cold feeling settling in his stomach. His son, his only child, somehow connected to whatever secrets lay at the end of that chain. It was too much of a coincidence. Not over the phone, Sam. James paused. I'm driving up tomorrow. Don't do anything until I get there. And Dad, watch out for men in black SUVs. I'm serious. The call ended, leaving the three of them in stunned silence. Well, Frank said finally, that complicates things. Eleanor rose and disappeared into the house, returning a moment later with a bottle of scotch and 3 glasses. I think we've officially moved beyond iced tea territory. She poured generous measures and handed them around. Nathan, did you know your son was involved in classified work? He's an engineer. Said he was designing power systems for a defense contractor. Nathan stared into his glass. We don't talk much these days. Not since Margaret died. Meridian isn't just any defense contractor, Frank said. They're deep into next-generation energy research. Black budget stuff. The implications hung in the air between them. James might know more about what they were dealing with than any of them. But that also meant others would know about their discovery soon, if they didn't already. We need to move quickly, Eleanor decided, setting down her glass. If your son is coming tomorrow, we should learn as much as we can before then. I have research materials here that might help us understand what we're dealing with. And I can get diving equipment, Frank added. We should see where that chain leads while we still can. Nathan nodded, his resolve hardening. I'll need to borrow a winch from the harbor. If we're going to pull up whatever's down there, we'll need more power than muscle. Be discreet, Eleanor cautioned. The fewer people who know what we're doing, the better. As they finalized their plans, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the porch. Eleanor invited them to stay for dinner, and they accepted, grateful for the chance to continue their conversation in private. She was a surprisingly good cook, serving a seafood stew that reminded Nathan of his grandmother's recipe. Over dinner, the conversation turned to personal histories. Eleanor spoke of her decades of research, her determination to bring to light the classified operations that had shaped the post-war world. Frank shared stories from his time as a SEAL, carefully editing out the classified details but painting a vivid picture of the brotherhood he had found there. Nathan spoke little, but when pressed, described his years in the Marines, the discipline and purpose it had given him after a restless youth. What none of them mentioned was the fear that had settled over the table like an invisible guest. The fear of what might happen if they disturbed something that had been deliberately hidden for nearly 8 decades. The fear of forces beyond their control, of secrets that might be better left undiscovered. Later, as Nathan drove home through the gathering darkness, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had set something in motion that could not be stopped. Like pulling on that chain, once you started, you were committed to seeing what emerged from the depths, whether you were prepared for it or not. Back at his house, he found himself drawn again to his grandfather's study. He sat at the old desk, the journal open before him, tracing the edges where pages had been cut out. What had been written there that needed to be removed? Who had removed them, his grandfather or someone else? As he turned the remaining pages, something fluttered to the floor, a photograph he had missed earlier. It showed his grandfather standing alone on a beach that Nathan recognized as Black Rock Point, though it looked different somehow, wilder. John Hayes was staring out to sea, his posture rigid, his face set in lines of grim determination. On the back, written in the same careful hand, The Burden of Knowing, May 1946. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the distant rumble of thunder. Another storm was coming. Nathan moved to the window, watching as clouds scudded across the face of the moon, alternately revealing and concealing the restless surface of the sea. That night, his dreams were troubled. He stood on a beach of black sand, watching as an enormous chain rose from the water, link by rusted link. At the end of the chain was not a submarine or a weapon, but a door, a massive iron door that hung suspended above the waves. From behind it came a blue light, pulsing like a heartbeat, and a low hum that he felt rather than heard. In the dream, his grandfather stood beside him, younger than Nathan had ever known him, dressed in the uniform of a Navy officer. Some doors should stay closed, Nathan, he said, his voice carrying clearly above the sound of the sea. But if they must be open, it should be by those who understand the responsibility of what lies beyond. Nathan woke with a start, the dream still vivid in his mind. The bedside clock read 3:17 a.m. Through his window, he could see that the storm had arrived. Rain lashed against the glass, and lightning illuminated the churning sea. As he watched, a flicker of blue light appeared near the water's edge. Not lightning, but the same eerie glow he had seen near the chain. It pulsed once, twice, 3 times, then vanished, leaving him to wonder if it had been real or merely an echo of his dream. Either way, the message seemed clear. Whatever waited at the end of that chain was awakening after its long sleep. And it was calling to him, across the decades, across the boundary between the world of the living and the world of secrets, long buried beneath the waves. Nathan Hayes would answer that call, not because he sought glory or treasure or even knowledge, but because his grandfather had entrusted him with a task left unfinished. And in the Hayes family, debts were always paid, promises always kept, even those that spanned generations. As the storm raged outside, Nathan made his decision. Tomorrow they would follow the chain to its end. They would uncover what had been hidden, and they would face whatever consequences came with that discovery. Some doors should stay closed, his dream grandfather had said. But this one had already been cracked open by time and tide. Now it was up to Nathan to step through and confront what waited on the other side. Dawn broke reluctantly through the remnants of the storm, pale light filtering through clouds that hung low and heavy over Stormhaven. The rain had stopped, but the wind remained, whipping the sea into white-capped waves that crashed against the shore with unusual force. Nathan stood at his kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, watching the harbor below, where fishermen assessed the damage to their boats and equipment. Most would stay in port today. The storm had churned up the seabed, making the water murky and fishing nearly impossible. For Nathan's purposes, however, the timing couldn't have been better. Fewer eyes on the water meant fewer questions about what he and Frank were planning. He had slept little after the dream, spending the pre-dawn hours gathering equipment, heavy gloves, waterproof flashlights, extra batteries, and the diving gear he kept for underwater repairs to his boat. Not enough for a deep exploration, but sufficient to follow the chain a short distance beneath the surface. The doorbell rang at precisely 6:30. Frank Sylviaden stood on the porch, looking more alive than Nathan had seen him in years. He wore olive drab pants and a navy blue windbreaker with a small American flag pin on the collar. Behind him, a battered pickup truck idled in the driveway, its bed loaded with equipment under a tarp. "Sleep well?" Frank asked, though his knowing smile suggested he already had the answer. "About as well as you'd expect." Nathan stepped aside to let him in. "Coffee?" "Already had 3 cups. Any more and my remaining leg will start twitching." Frank moved to the kitchen table, spreading out a nautical chart of the coastline. "Eleanor loaned me this. It's from 1940, shows the underwater topography around Black Rock Point before any modern surveys." Nathan examined the chart. The area near the point was marked with unusual detail: depth soundings, underwater rock formations, and notations about currents that weren't present on modern maps. "Look here," Frank pointed to an area just off the point. "There's a deep channel that cuts through the reef, leading to what looks like an underwater cavern system. Modern charts don't show this at all." "Deliberate omission?" "That would be my guess. Perfect place to hide something you don't want found." Frank folded the chart carefully. "I've got diving equipment for both of us, plus an underwater camera. Borrowed an electric winch from a buddy at the boatyard. Said I was pulling up some old lobster traps." "Any sign of those government types James mentioned?" Frank's expression darkened. "Saw a black Suburban at the gas station on my way here. 2 men in suits at 6 in the morning in a fishing town. They weren't tourists." Nathan nodded, unsurprised. "How much time do you think we have?" "Not much. If they're already here, they'll be watching the point. We need to move now. Use the bad weather as cover." Frank glanced out the window at the churning sea. Not ideal conditions for diving, but it might be our only chance. Nathan grabbed his gear bag and followed Frank to the truck. As they loaded the last of the equipment, he noticed a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision. Someone watching from a neighboring house. Mrs. Calloway, the retired school teacher who had lived there for 40 years. She ducked away from her window when she saw him looking. Word was spreading. In a town like Stormhaven, it was impossible to keep secrets for long. "We should bring the sheriff in on this," Nathan said as they drove toward the harbor. "Mike Donovan's solid. We served together in Desert Storm." Frank considered this, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. "Might not be a bad idea to have law enforcement on our side, especially if those government boys start throwing their weight around. Donovan still keeps that Mossberg 590 under his desk?" "Far as I know." "Good. We'll swing by the station after we pick up the winch." The harbor was quieter than usual, most of the fishing fleet secured against the rough seas. They loaded the electric winch onto the truck without difficulty, drawing only a few curious glances from the men working nearby. Nathan nodded greetings but didn't stop to chat, aware that every minute counted now. The sheriff's office occupied a small brick building near the town square, its weathered sign proclaiming Stormhaven Police Department above the entrance. Inside, the front desk was unmanned, typical for early morning in a town with a 3-person police force. Sheriff Mike Donovan's office door stood open. He looked up from his paperwork as they entered, his weathered face breaking into a smile that quickly faded when he registered their expressions. Frank, Nathan, he set down his pen. Either you boys caught the world's biggest tuna, or you're about to tell me something I don't want to hear. Bit of both, Frank said, closing the door behind them. They laid out the situation quickly. The chain, the connection to U-731, the historical evidence, and the government observers who had appeared in town. Donovan listened without interruption, his face growing more serious with each detail. Jesus, he said when they finished. And you're sure about this? About the submarine and whatever classified tech it was carrying? As sure as we can be without seeing it ourselves, Nathan replied. Donovan leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his close-cropped gray hair. You know, I spent time with JSOC after the Gulf. Saw things that never made the official reports. Learned that sometimes the government keeps secrets for good reasons. And sometimes they don't, Frank countered. Sometimes they bury things because it's easier than admitting mistakes, or because someone benefits from keeping the status quo. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. This about Richardson again, Frank. You still fighting that old war? Frank stiffened. This is about finding the truth, about finishing something Nathan's grandfather started. Donovan studied them both for a long moment, then sighed. All right, what do you need from me? Official oversight, Nathan said. Whatever we find down there could have historical significance. We need a law enforcement presence to ensure everything's handled properly. What he didn't say, but all three men understood, was that Donovan's presence would provide a thin layer of legal protection if the government agents decided to intervene. I'll come, Donovan agreed, but we do this by the book. Anything we find gets properly documented. No amateur treasure hunting. He opened a drawer and took out a small digital camera. And I want everything recorded. As they left the station, Nathan caught Frank giving the sheriff a speculative look. What? Just wondering whose side he's really on, Frank murmured. Man spent a lot of years following orders. Mike's a straight shooter, always has been. Hope you're right. Frank glanced at the rearview mirror as they pulled away from the curb, because we've got company. Nathan turned to see a black Suburban pulling out behind them, maintaining a discreet distance. Not even trying to be subtle, are they? They don't need to be. They're just letting us know they're watching. They took an indirect route to Black Rock Point, driving past the harbor and along the coastal road before doubling back on a service track that wound through the pine forest behind the beach. The Suburban didn't follow them onto the rough track, but Nathan had no doubt their movements were still being monitored. Donovan met them at the agreed location, having driven his own patrol vehicle. He had changed into casual clothes, but wore his service weapon on his hip and carried his badge in his pocket. Official capacity, he explained, checking a potential hazard to navigation. The beach looked different in the aftermath of the storm. New debris had washed ashore, and the sand had shifted, revealing more of the chain than before. The water was turbulent, waves breaking against the rocks with explosive force, sending spray high into the air. Not ideal diving conditions, Frank observed, eyeing the churning sea. We don't need to go deep, Nathan replied, just far enough to see where the chain leads. They set up the winch on stable ground above the high tide line, securing it with metal stakes driven deep into the sand. Frank, with his expertise in underwater operations, checked over their diving equipment one final time. Remember, we're just doing a reconnaissance, he instructed. 30 minutes max. If the chain leads into a cave system, we mark the location and come back with proper cave diving gear. Donovan stood watch, camera in hand, documenting their preparations while scanning the tree line and dunes for any observers. You're clear for now, he reported, but I'd bet my pension those suits are watching from somewhere. Nathan and Frank donned their wetsuits and checked their communications gear. Simple underwater signaling devices that would allow them to maintain contact. The plan was straightforward. Follow the chain as far as safely possible, document what they found with the underwater camera, and return to the surface. As Nathan prepared to enter the water, he noticed something strange. The blue luminescence they had seen before was visible even in daylight, a faint glow pulsing beneath the waves where the chain disappeared. You see that? He asked Frank, pointing. Frank nodded grimly. Something down there is definitely active. Be extra cautious. If you feel any unusual sensations, disorientation, nausea, anything, we abort immediately. They waded into the churning surf, fighting against the powerful undertow that tried to drag them toward the rocks. The water was cold despite their wetsuits, a bone-deep chill that seemed to intensify as they neared the submerged chain. Underwater, visibility was poor, perhaps 10 feet at most, the water clouded with stirred-up sand and debris. Nathan switched on his dive light, the beam cutting through the murk to illuminate the chain where it descended toward the seabed. Frank followed close behind, the underwater camera secured to his wrist. The chain angled downward at about 45 degrees, leading them deeper with each yard. Nathan counted the links as they descended, 20, 30, 40, each bearing the same mysterious markings they had observed on the beach. The blue glow grew stronger as they followed the chain, no longer just a distant pulse, but a consistent illumination that seemed to emanate from the direction they were heading. At approximately 50 feet down, the topography changed dramatically. The sandy bottom gave way to a jagged rock formation, the underwater extension of Black Rock Point. The chain threaded through a narrow crevice in the rock face, disappearing into darkness beyond. Frank tapped Nathan's shoulder and signaled toward the opening. It was wide enough for them to pass through single file, but only barely. Nathan hesitated, aware of the risks of entering such a confined space without proper cave diving equipment. But the blue light beckoned from within, and the mystery of what lay beyond was too compelling to resist. He signaled his intention to proceed and, receiving Frank's reluctant acknowledgement, carefully navigated the narrow passage. The rock walls closed in around him, rough stones scraping against his wetsuit. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm him. The primal fear of being trapped underwater, with tons of rock pressing in from all sides. He forced himself to breathe steadily through his regulator, focusing on the chain that continued to guide their way. The passage widened suddenly, opening into a submerged chamber that took Nathan's breath away. It was a perfect half-dome, perhaps 30 feet in diameter, with walls that appeared to be partially natural and partially constructed. Smooth sections of what looked like concrete interspersed with the raw rock of the cavern. And there, secured to the chamber floor by the massive chain, was a structure unlike anything Nathan had ever seen. Not a submarine as they had expected, but a bunker, a man-made installation built into the natural cavern, its entrance a circular hatch of gleaming metal that showed barely any sign of corrosion despite decades underwater. The blue light they had observed emanated from around the edges of the hatch, pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm that reminded Nathan unsettlingly of a heartbeat. The chain they had followed wrapped around the structure multiple times before connecting to a locking mechanism on the hatch itself. Frank had joined him now, his eyes wide behind his diving mask. He gestured toward the hatch, then to the underwater camera, beginning to document their discovery with methodical precision. Nathan swam closer, examining the construction. The bunker appeared to be made of reinforced concrete, with metal reinforcements visible where sections had been joined together. Near the hatch, he found a plaque partially obscured by marine growth. He carefully brushed away the accumulation, revealing the emblem of the U.S. Navy, and beneath it, the words Poseidon Containment Facility and the date 1945. This was it, the secret his grandfather had helped bury, the technology deemed too dangerous or revolutionary to be revealed to the world. It had been here all along, hidden beneath the waves just a few hundred yards from where he had fished his entire life. Frank tapped his dive computer, signaling that their air supply was running low. They needed to return to the surface. Nathan nodded his understanding, but found himself reluctant to leave. After coming this far, the thought of departing without seeing what lay inside the bunker was almost physically painful. As if sensing his hesitation, Frank gripped his arm firmly and pointed emphatically toward the surface. The message was clear. They would return better prepared. This was just the beginning. With a final glance at the mysterious bunker, Nathan followed Frank back through the narrow passage and up toward daylight, his mind racing with questions. What was contained inside? Why had it been sealed away rather than brought to shore? And why, after all these decades, was it still active, still pulsing with that eerie blue light? When they broke the surface, Donovan was waiting anxiously at the water's edge, his hand resting on his service weapon. The reason for his tension became immediately apparent. The black Suburban was now parked at the edge of the beach, and two men in dark suits stood watching their emergence from the sea. "We've got company," Donovan called as they waded to shore, keeping his voice low. They arrived about 10 minutes after you went under. Haven't approached yet, just watching. Nathan and Frank quickly removed their diving gear, Frank securing the underwater camera in a waterproof case that he handed to Donovan for safekeeping. Get that somewhere safe, he murmured. It's evidence of what's down there. Donovan nodded, tucking the case into his jacket. What did you find? Not a submarine, Nathan replied, keeping his voice low. A bunker, built into an underwater cavern. Whatever they were hiding, it's still there, still active somehow. Before Donovan could respond, the two men in suits began approaching, walking with the confident stride of federal agents who were accustomed to deference. As they drew closer, Nathan could make out their features, both in their 40s, clean-cut and physically fit. The older of the two, a man with salt and pepper hair and a face that seemed permanently set in a stern expression, took the lead. Gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of the waves. I'm Special Agent Richardson, Office of Naval Intelligence. He flashed a badge briefly. This is Agent Taylor. We'd like to speak with you about your activities here. Frank went rigid beside Nathan. Richardson, he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. Any relation to Admiral William Richardson? The agent's eyes narrowed slightly. He was my father. Did you know him? Vietnam, 1972, Frank said flatly. He left my team to die in the jungle when an operation went sideways. 4 good men never came home because of his decision. A tense silence followed. Agent Richardson's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or a carefully controlled anger. Ancient history, he said finally. We're here about a more current concern. You've been interfering with a restricted naval installation. This area is off limits to civilian diving. Donovan stepped forward, deliberately positioning himself between the agents and Nathan and Frank. I don't recall seeing any notices to that effect, Agent Richardson. And as the local law enforcement authority, I think I would have been informed of any federal restrictions in my jurisdiction. Richardson's gaze shifted to Donovan, assessing. The restrictions date back to 1945, Sheriff. They were never rescinded. Convenient, Frank muttered. What exactly is down there, Agent Richardson? Nathan asked directly. What was so important that it had to be chained to the seafloor for 80 years? That's classified information, Mr. Hayes. Richardson's tone made it clear he knew exactly who Nathan was. What I can tell you is that you're tampering with technology that remains sensitive to national security. We're asking you officially to cease all activities related to this site immediately. Asking or ordering? Frank challenged. For now, asking. Richardson's smile didn't reach his eyes. I'd prefer not to complicate things by involving federal charges. Donovan cleared his throat. As I see it, Agent Richardson, these men discovered what appears to be a historical site of potential archaeological significance. Until you produce documentation proving federal jurisdiction, they're within their rights to investigate, with proper oversight. He tapped the badge in his pocket, which I'm providing. Richardson studied Donovan for a moment, then nodded slightly, as if coming to a decision. Very well, Sheriff. We'll return with the necessary documentation. In the meantime, I strongly advise all of you to reconsider your involvement in this matter. Some doors are better left closed. He glanced pointedly at Frank, as my father discovered to his regret. With that cryptic statement hanging in the air, Richardson and his partner turned and walked back toward their vehicle. What did he mean by that? Nathan asked Frank once the agents were out of earshot. Frank shook his head, his expression troubled. Not sure. Richardson Sr. ended his career early, retired under something of a cloud in the mid-90s. Rumors of drinking problems, erratic behavior. I always figured it was karma catching up to him. They'll be back, Donovan warned, watching the Suburban pull away. With paperwork and probably reinforcements. We don't have much time. Then we need to work fast, Nathan decided. That chain is the key to whatever's down there. If we can raise it, maybe we can open the hatch. They returned to the winch, securing the heavy-duty cable to the exposed section of chain. The electric motor strained against the weight, the cable growing taut as it took up the slack. For a moment, Nathan feared the stake anchors would pull free from the sand, but they held firm as the winch slowly began to draw up the massive chain. Link by link, the chain emerged from the water streaming from the corroded metal. The work was painstaking, the winch laboring against not just the weight of the chain itself, but whatever it secured below. Every few minutes, they had to pause to reset the cable attachment point farther down the chain. As they worked, the sky darkened again, clouds thickening overhead. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. Another storm was approaching, as if nature itself were responding to their disturbance of long-buried secrets. "We should call Eleanor," Frank suggested during one of their pauses. "She needs to see this, and we could use her expertise on the historical context." Nathan agreed, placing the call on his cell phone. Eleanor answered immediately, as if she'd been waiting by the phone. "We found something," Nathan told her, keeping the details minimal in case the call was being monitored. "A structure, not a vessel. You should come see for yourself." "I'll be there in 20 minutes," she replied without hesitation. "And Nathan? Sarah Jenkins was here earlier, asking questions about your activities. She knows something's happening at the point." "The reporter?" Nathan frowned. "What did you tell her?" "Nothing specific, but she's persistent, and she mentioned her father disappeared near Black Rock Point 15 years ago. She believes there's a connection." Nathan remembered Sarah, a fierce young woman who had returned to Stormhaven after journalism school, determined to uncover the truth about her father's mysterious disappearance. His fishing boat had been found drifting empty, with no sign of violence or struggle. The official ruling had been accidental drowning, but Sarah had never accepted that explanation. "Bring her with you," he decided impulsively. "If there is a connection, she deserves to know." Frank raised an eyebrow at this, but didn't object. They resumed their work, the chain continuing its slow emergence from the depths. By the time Eleanor's car appeared on the road above the beach, they had raised nearly 100 feet of chain, creating a massive coil on the sand. Eleanor was not alone. Sarah Jenkins sat in the passenger seat, her expression a mixture of suspicion and barely contained excitement. At 35, she still carried herself with the intense energy that had marked her even as a child. Always questioning, always pushing boundaries. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore hiking boots and a weatherproof jacket, clearly prepared for whatever she might encounter. As they approached, Sarah immediately began taking photos with a professional-grade camera, documenting the scene. "Mr. Hayes," she acknowledged Nathan with a nod, "want to tell me why the Office of Naval Intelligence is suddenly interested in our little town? And why you're pulling up what looks like a small ship's anchor chain from the water?" "It's not an anchor chain," Eleanor interjected, kneeling to examine the links. "It's a containment system, and based on these markings, it's exactly what we suspected. Part of Operation Poseidon." Sarah's camera lowered slightly. "Operation Poseidon? What is that?" "The reason your father disappeared," Frank said bluntly. "Or at least that's our working theory." Sarah went very still, her knuckles whitening around her camera. "Explain." While the winch continued its laborious task, they briefed Sarah on their discoveries. The bunker beneath the waves, the strange blue light, the government agents who had warned them away. Sarah listened without interruption, her journalist mind visibly processing each piece of information. "My father reported seeing unusual lights in the water near Black Rock Point," she said when they had finished. "Several times in the months before he disappeared. No one believed him. They said it was phosphorescence or reflection from the lighthouse." "The blue glow," Nathan nodded. "We've seen it too. Whatever's down there, it's still active after all these years." "And you think my father found it? Found this bunker?" "It's possible," Eleanor said gently. "If he was fishing near the point and saw the lights, he might have investigated. If he discovered something the government wanted to keep secret." She didn't need to finish the thought. The implication hung heavy in the air between them. Sarah's jaw set in a determined line. "I want to see it. Whatever's down there, I need to see it for myself." Before anyone could respond, the winch motor suddenly whined in protest, straining against an immovable weight. The chain had gone taut, rising from the water in a straight line rather than the gentle curve they had seen before. "We've reached the end," Frank announced, "or at least the point where it's secured to the bunker." They gathered at the water's edge, staring at the taut chain that disappeared beneath the surface. The blue glow was visible now, even in daylight, a pulsing radiance that seemed to have intensified since their dive. "What now?" Donovan asked, voicing the question on everyone's mind. "We follow it down again." "Yeah, and," Nathan decided, "but this time we try to open the hatch." Frank looked skeptical. "With what?" We don't have the equipment for a sustained underwater operation. We don't need to sustain it just long enough to see what's inside. Nathan turned to Sarah. Can you dive? She nodded. Certified advanced open water. I did underwater photography in college. Good. You'll come with us to document what we find. He glanced at the darkening sky. We need to move quickly before the storm hits and before our friends from Naval Intelligence return. Eleanor and Donovan would remain on shore, maintaining communication and keeping watch for any sign of the government agents. The plan was simple but dangerous. Nathan, Frank, and Sarah would dive to the bunker, attempt to open the hatch, and document whatever they found inside. As they prepared the diving equipment, Nathan felt a growing sense of anticipation mixed with dread. They were about to uncover a secret that had been buried for generations, a secret his grandfather had helped conceal, but had also, in his own way, ensured would eventually come to light. Whatever waited beyond that hatch, whatever technology or knowledge had been deemed too dangerous for the world of 1945, was about to be revealed. Nathan only hoped they were ready for the consequences of that revelation. The storm clouds gathered overhead, casting the beach in premature twilight. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a warning of the tempest to come. But for Nathan, the real storm was the one brewing beneath the waves, where a relic of the past pulsed with unnatural light, as if awakening from a long sleep. The water was significantly colder than during their first dive, a bone-deep chill that penetrated their wetsuits and set teeth chattering despite the physical exertion of swimming. Nathan led the way, following the now familiar chain down to where it disappeared into the narrow crevice in the rock face. Behind him, Sarah documented everything with her underwater camera, her movements displaying the confidence of an experienced diver. Frank brought up the rear, carrying a waterproof bag containing tools they hoped might help open the hatch. The passage through the rock seemed tighter than before, forcing them to remove their tanks and push them ahead before squeezing through themselves. Nathan felt the rough stone scrape against his wetsuit, felt the weight of the rock above pressing down with suffocating intensity. A momentary flash of claustrophobia gripped him, the fear of being trapped in this underwater tomb, far from air and light. He forced it down, focusing instead on the blue glow that beckoned from beyond the narrow channel. When they emerged into the chamber, Sarah's reaction was visible even through her diving mask. Wide eyes filled with wonder and disbelief as she took in the bunker structure with its circular hatch. The blue light pulsed more rapidly now, as if responding to their presence. She immediately began capturing images, circling the structure to document it from every angle. Nathan and Frank approached the hatch, examining the locking mechanism where the chain connected. It was more complex than it had appeared during their first visit. Not a simple padlock or bolt, but an intricate system of interlocking components that seemed designed to resist tampering. Frank reached into his waterproof bag and produced a specialized wrench, indicating a large coupling near where the chain attached. Nathan nodded his understanding, bracing himself against the bunker's surface to provide leverage while Frank applied the tool. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden give that sent vibrations through the water, the coupling began to turn. Encouraged, Frank continued the motion, completing a full rotation before the mechanism locked again. The blue light flickered, its rhythm changing from a steady pulse to an erratic flashing. Around them, the water seemed to shift, currents stirring where there had been stillness before. Sarah had finished her circuit of the bunker and now joined them at the hatch, her camera focused on the locking mechanism as they worked. Frank tried another coupling, then another, following a sequence that seemed to match the pattern of symbols they had observed on the chain links. With each successful turn, the locking mechanism reconfigured itself, components sliding and rotating like an enormous puzzle box. Nathan realized they were witnessing the work of brilliant engineering, a security system designed to resist not just the corrosive effects of seawater for decades, but also any unauthorized attempt at entry. Only someone with knowledge of the specific sequence, encoded in the chain's markings, would be able to open it. Fortunately, Frank's years of experience with naval systems gave him an intuitive understanding of the mechanism's logic. After nearly 15 minutes of painstaking work, there was a deep, resonant clunk that they felt rather than heard through the water. The entire hatch shuddered, and a ring of metal around its circumference retracted into the bunker wall. The blue light suddenly intensified, bright enough to be painful to the eyes. Sarah gestured urgently to her camera, indicating that something was interfering with its operation. Frank checked his dive computer, frowning as he noticed the display flickering erratically. Nathan pointed to their air gauges, reminding them of their limited time. Then, with a nod to his companions, he gripped the now loosened hatch wheel and began to turn it. The resistance was immense, decades of inactivity having seized the mechanism. Frank joined him, adding his strength to the effort. Slowly, grudgingly, the wheel began to rotate. As it turned, the blue light pulsed in sync with their movements, growing brighter with each increment. With a final, wrenching effort, the wheel completed its rotation. Water pressure did the rest, the hatch swinging inward with unexpected suddenness that nearly pulled Nathan with it. A rush of bubbles escaped from within, along with a surge of the blue light, now so intense it illuminated the entire chamber. Beyond the hatch was not a flooded compartment, as they had expected, but an air pocket, a tunnel that angled upward, its walls lined with metal and concrete. The blue light emanated from strip-like fixtures embedded in the walls, technology that had somehow remained functional after 8 decades underwater. They exchanged glances, communication limited to hand signals and expressions visible through their masks. The discovery of an air pocket changed everything. If the bunker contained breathable air, they could potentially explore it without the severe time constraints imposed by their tanks. Frank signaled a cautious approach, indicating that he would test the air quality before anyone removed their regulators. Nathan nodded agreement, and they swam carefully into the tunnel, rising gradually toward what appeared to be a secondary hatch about 20 feet in. The tunnel ended in a small chamber with a raised platform that stood above the water level. Frank surfaced first, taking a cautious breath of the air before removing his regulator. He nodded to the others. The air was stale but breathable. They removed their masks and hoods, blinking in the strange blue light. The chamber was clearly an airlock of sorts, designed to allow access to the bunker without flooding its interior. A second hatch, this one conventional in design, was set into the far wall. "This is incredible," Sarah whispered, her voice echoing in the confined space. "How is this even possible? How could they build something like this underwater in 1945? "They didn't," Frank replied, examining the construction. "They built it on land, then sank it into position. Look at the seams, prefabricated sections joined together, advanced for its time, but feasible with the technology they had." "And the air?" Nathan asked. "How is it still breathable after all this time?" "Some kind of self-contained environmental system," Frank theorized. "Maybe running on the same power source that's generating that light." Sarah was already documenting the chamber, her camera having returned to normal operation now that they were out of the water. "This goes way beyond anything in the historical record," she murmured. "A fully functional underwater bunker from 1945, still powered after 80 years? This isn't just classified technology. This is game-changing." Nathan approached the inner hatch, studying its wheel mechanism. Unlike the outer hatch, this one bore a conventional combination lock, a dial with numbers from 0 to 99. "We need a code," he said. Frank joined him, frowning at the lock. "The numbers on the chain links, 731, the U-boat number." "Worth a try." Nathan rotated the dial carefully. 731. Nothing happened. "Maybe it's a date," Sarah suggested. "When was Operation Poseidon initiated?" "Eleanor would know," Frank said. "But we're out of communication range down here." Nathan stared at the lock, thinking of his grandfather's journal. "What's in compartment 7 must never surface," he murmured, then looked up sharply. "Compartment 7, that's it." He rotated the dial again. 777. The lock clicked, and the wheel mechanism unlocked with a soft hiss of equalizing pressure. "How did you know?" Sarah asked, her camera focused on the hatch. "My grandfather's warning. He wasn't just saying that whatever was in compartment 7 should stay buried. He was leaving the combination in plain sight for anyone who knew what to look for." Frank's expression darkened. "Or he was warning us not to open it at all." Nathan met his friend's gaze. Too late for that now. With a deep breath, he turned the wheel and pulled the hatch open. Beyond lay darkness, broken only by the same blue lighting strips that ran along the floor like runway lights, leading deeper into the bunker. They stepped through cautiously, finding themselves in a narrow corridor that branched in 3 directions. Each branch was marked with a number, E6 and 7. Compartment 7, Nathan said, pointing to the rightmost corridor. That's where we need to go. What about our air supply? Sarah asked practically. We're committed now. We can't get back to the surface without going through the flooded section. Frank checked his dive computer. We've got about 40 minutes of air left, enough to explore briefly and return to the surface. But we'll need to be quick. They moved down the corridor marked 7, the blue lights brightening as they approached, as if responding to their presence. The air grew warmer with a faint electrical scent that reminded Nathan of the interior of a computer server room. The corridor ended at yet another hatch, this one already partially open. Beyond it lay compartment 7, and the secret that had been deemed important enough to hide beneath the waves for nearly a century. Nathan pushed the hatch fully open, and they stepped into a large, circular room that took their breath away. The ceiling was domed, at least 20 feet high at its center, with the blue lighting strips converging at a central point like the spokes of a wheel. The walls were lined with what appeared to be control panels and monitoring equipment, remarkably well preserved despite the decades. But it was what stood at the center of the room that commanded their attention. A cylindrical device, perhaps 10 feet tall and 6 feet in diameter, constructed of a silvery metal that seemed to glow with an inner light. It pulsed with the same blue radiance they had observed from the surface, the rhythm now more rapid, more urgent. Around the base of the device were workstations with chairs still positioned as if their occupants had just stepped away for a moment. Papers and logbooks lay open on the desks, preserved in the controlled environment. My God, Frank breathed, moving closer to the central device. I've never seen anything like this. Sarah was documenting everything, her camera clicking rapidly as she circled the room. What is it? Some kind of weapon? I don't think so, Nathan said, examining one of the workstations. He picked up a logbook, its pages yellowed but still legible. The handwriting was neat, scientific, with diagrams and equations that meant nothing to him. But the header on each page was clear enough. Project Poseidon, Cold Fusion Containment Protocols. It's an energy source, Wadey said, looking up at the pulsing cylinder. They weren't hiding a weapon. They were hiding a new form of power generation. Frank had found another document, this one in a folder marked Classified, Security Level Alpha. He read silently for a moment, his expression growing increasingly troubled. Not just any energy source, he said finally. According to this, it's a self-sustaining cold fusion reactor developed by German scientists in the final years of the war. The U-boat was transporting both the prototype and the research team to South America when it was intercepted. Cold fusion? Sarah looked skeptical. That's still theoretical even today. How could they have developed a working prototype in the 1940s? The same way they were years ahead in rocket technology, Frank replied. Brilliant scientists, unlimited resources, and freedom from ethical constraints. He turned a page in the folder. This says the reactor was designed to provide virtually unlimited clean energy with no radioactive waste. It uses seawater as its primary fuel. The implications were staggering. Such technology, if it had been developed and deployed instead of being hidden away, could have transformed the world's energy landscape, eliminated dependence on fossil fuels, prevented decades of environmental damage. Why hide it? Sarah asked, giving voice to the question in all their minds. Why not use it? Politics, Frank said grimly. Oil companies, coal interests, they had too much power, too much influence, and the military was focused on nuclear weapons, not clean energy. He closed the folder. Imagine how much money and power would have been lost if this technology had been made public. Nathan had moved to another workstation where he found a journal with familiar handwriting, his grandfather's neat, precise script. He opened it carefully, finding the missing pages that had been cut from the journal in his possession. My grandfather was the security officer for the project, he said, skimming the entries. He was responsible for ensuring the technology remained contained. But he turned more pages, reading faster. He disagreed with the decision to keep it secret. He argued that it should be studied, developed for peaceful purposes. And he lost that argument, Frank surmised. Yes, but he left clues, the markings on the chain, the journal entries he didn't destroy. He wanted someone to find this eventually. He believed the world would be ready for it someday. Sarah had discovered something else, a filing cabinet containing personnel records. She pulled out a folder, her hands trembling slightly. "My father's name is in here," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "He's listed as a security incident from 2008. It says he accidentally discovered the bunker while diving for lobsters. He was processed according to containment protocols." The clinical language couldn't disguise the horrible truth. Sarah's father had stumbled upon the secret bunker and had been killed to maintain that secret. The mysterious disappearance that had haunted Sarah for 15 years had been a government-sanctioned elimination of a witness. "There's more," she said, turning a page. A note from someone named John Hayes, dated 2010. He was retired by then, but still had access to the files. "He wrote a formal protest about my father's death, argued that the containment protocols were outdated and unethical." Nathan felt a surge of pride in his grandfather. Even in his final years, John Hayes had fought for what he believed was right. He knew, Nathan realized, when the storm uncovered that chain, when I found it, it wasn't an accident. My grandfather made sure it would be found eventually, made sure someone would uncover the truth. The blue light from the reactor suddenly intensified, the pulsing becoming more rapid. A low hum filled the room, vibrating through the floor and walls. "Something's happening," Frank warned, backing away from the central device. "The system's responding to our presence, to our disturbance." A mechanical voice crackled from speakers hidden in the ceiling. "Warning, containment protocols compromised. Emergency venting sequence initiated." "We need to get out of here," Frank urged, already moving toward the exit. "Now!" They gathered what documentation they could carry, the logbooks, the personnel files, the most crucial technical documents, and hurried back down the corridor toward the airlock. Behind them, the humming grew louder, and the blue light flared with increasing brightness. As they reached the airlock, the entire structure shuddered, as if struck by an enormous force. Water began seeping through seams in the walls, small jets that quickly grew in volume. "The bunker's destabilizing," Frank shouted over the growing noise. "Probably has automatic self-destruct protocols if compromised. We need to get to the surface before the whole thing floods." They donned their diving gear with frantic haste, securing the documents in waterproof bags. The water level in the airlock was rising rapidly, already knee-deep in climbing. "Stay together," Nathan instructed as they replaced their regulators. "Follow the chain back to the surface. Don't stop for anything." The water reached their chests, then their shoulders. With a final exchange of glances, they submerged just as the inner hatch burst inward under the pressure, flooding the chamber completely. The trip back through the tunnel was a nightmare of swirling currents and disorientation. The blue light had become a strobing flash that made it difficult to see. Nathan led the way, gripping the chain with one hand to maintain their course through the turbulence. When they reached the outer hatch, they found it had sealed itself, an automatic safety feature triggered by the bunker's destabilization. Frank immediately set to work with his tools, attempting to override the locking mechanism while Nathan and Sarah braced themselves against the growing current that threatened to sweep them away. Sarah pointed urgently to her air gauge. They were running dangerously low. Frank worked faster, his movements hampered by the swirling water, but driven by the knowledge that their lives depended on his success. With a final, desperate effort, he managed to disengage the lock. The hatch swung open, nearly crushing them against the wall with its momentum. They swam through just as a shock wave of pressure erupted from within the bunker, propelling them through the narrow rock crevice and out into open water. The ascent to the surface was a blur of bubbles and blue light. They rose too quickly, risking decompression sickness, but the alternative was drowning as their air supplies dwindled to nothing. Nathan's ears popped painfully, and his vision began to darken around the edges, signs of oxygen deprivation that he recognized from his military training. Then suddenly they broke the surface, gasping for air as they tore off their masks. The storm had arrived in full force while they were underwater, rain lashing the churning sea and lightning splitting the sky above. Through the downpour, Nathan could make out figures on the shore, Eleanor and Donovan, and beside them, two new arrivals. As they swam toward land, fighting against the powerful surf, Nathan recognized one of the figures, his son, James, who had arrived as promised. The other was an older man, tall and distinguished, wearing a raincoat over what appeared to be a suit. When they finally staggered onto the beach, exhausted and chilled to the bone, James rushed forward to help his father. "Dad, what happened down there? The water's glowing and there was some kind of underwater explosion." "The bunker, there," Nathan gasped, still catching his breath. "It's destabilizing. Whatever containment system they had in place, we triggered a failure when we opened the inner hatches." The older man stepped forward, his expression grave. "You found compartment 7 then?" "I was afraid of this." Frank straightened, recognition dawning on his face. "Senator Williams, what are you doing here?" "Trying to prevent a catastrophe," the man replied, gesturing toward the water where the blue glow had intensified, spreading outward from the location of the bunker like a slowly expanding pool of light. That reactor was never meant to be disturbed. The containment protocols were designed to last a century, at which point a controlled decommissioning would take place. "You knew about this?" Sarah demanded, clutching the waterproof bag containing the evidence of her father's fate. "You knew about Project Poseidon?" "I chair the Senate Intelligence Committee, Miss Jenkins. There are few secrets of this magnitude that I'm not aware of." Williams turned to Nathan. "Your son contacted me yesterday. He works for a company that's been researching cold fusion technology based on fragments of the original Poseidon research. When he heard what you discovered, he recognized the implications immediately." James nodded, his face solemn. "The technology down there is revolutionary, Dad, but it's also unstable. If the containment fails completely..." He didn't need to finish the thought. The expanding blue glow in the water told its own story, energy being released in a way its creators had never intended. "We need to re-establish containment," Williams said urgently, "or evacuate the entire coastline. That reactor could release enough energy to trigger a tsunami that would devastate everything within 100 miles. Nathan looked out at the glowing water, then back at the small group gathered on the beach. His son, his oldest friend, the sheriff who had stood by them, the historian who had helped unravel the mystery, and the young reporter who had finally found the truth about her father's disappearance. Each of them now carried a piece of the secret that had been buried beneath the waves for so long. And in that moment, facing a potential catastrophe born from decades of secrecy and fear, Nathan knew that his grandfather had been right. The world needed to know the truth, not just about the revolutionary technology that had been hidden away, but about the choices that had been made to keep it secret and the lives that had been sacrificed to maintain that secrecy. Whatever happened next, the chains that had held this secret beneath the deep for nearly a century had finally been broken. Whether humanity was ready for what had been unleashed remained to be seen. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the beach in stark white flashes that revealed the full scope of their predicament. The blue glow had spread through the water in a perfect circle nearly 50 yards in diameter, pulsing with increasing intensity. Each pulse sent small waves radiating outward, growing larger with each cycle. Senator Williams was already on a satellite phone, speaking in clipped, urgent tones to someone with high-level clearance. "The Poseidon site has been compromised. Yes, full breach. Containment failure imminent. We need the response team at Black Rock Point immediately." Nathan turned to his son, still trying to process his presence. "How deep are you in this, James?" James Hayes looked remarkably like his father, the same steady eyes and stubborn jawline, but carried himself with the precise posture of someone who'd spent his days in corporate boardrooms rather than on fishing boats. Water dripped from his expensive raincoat as he surveyed the glowing water. "Meridian Defense acquired fragments of the original Poseidon research about 5 years ago," he explained, keeping his voice low. "Heavily redacted materials from declassified Navy archives. We've been working to recreate the technology, but we're decades away from a functioning prototype." He gestured toward the water. "What's down there is the only working cold fusion reactor on the planet. And now it's destabilizing," Frank said grimly, still clutching the waterproof bag containing the documents they'd recovered. "Because of us." "Not just because of you," Eleanor interjected, joining their huddle. "That facility was designed with 1940s technology. It's remarkable it remained stable for this long." Sarah had moved a short distance away, examining the contents of her own waterproof bag, the file detailing her father's processing. Her face was a mask of controlled grief and anger as she photographed each page with her backup camera. Sheriff Donovan stood at the edge of the group, dividing his attention between the conversation and the road above the beach, clearly expecting the arrival of government agents at any moment. "We need to evacuate," he said, practical as always. "How much time do we have before that thing blows?" James shook his head. "Hard to say. Cold fusion doesn't explode like nuclear fission. It's more like a massive energy discharge. Think of the world's largest EMP combined with a sudden release of heat energy." "How massive?" Nathan pressed. "Based on the theoretical output of the Poseidon design, enough to vaporize seawater for half a mile in every direction and generate a steam explosion that would trigger a localized tsunami. Stormhaven would be wiped off the map, and coastal areas up to 50 miles in either direction would face severe flooding." The implications settled over the group like a physical weight. Thousands of lives were at stake, and the clock was ticking. "There has to be a way to stabilize it," Nathan insisted, turning to Williams. "The people who built it must have had emergency protocols." "They did," the senator confirmed, returning from his call. "But those protocols involved a team of specialized technicians with equipment that no longer exists. The modern response team is trained for containment and cleanup, not intervention." "We can't just wait for it to blow," Frank growled. "There must be something in the documentation we recovered." He opened his waterproof bag, spreading the salvaged papers on the hood of Donovan's patrol vehicle, sheltering them from the rain with his body. The others gathered around, scanning the technical diagrams and densely written instructions for any information that might help them. "Here," Eleanor pointed to a section of text. "Emergency shutdown procedure. It describes a manual override sequence that can be initiated from compartment 5. "We were only in compartment 7, Nathan said. "We saw corridors leading to 5 and 6, but didn't explore them. The procedure requires simultaneous actions in both compartments 5 and 7. Eleanor continued reading. "A 2-person failsafe to prevent unauthorized shutdown." "The bunker's flooding," Frank reminded them. "We barely made it out alive. Going back in would be suicide." Nathan studied the diagram attached to the procedure. "Maybe not. Look here. The compartments are connected by emergency access tunnels. If the main corridor is flooded, these tunnels might still be intact." James leaned in, his engineer's eye assessing the schematic. "It's possible. The compartments appear to be designed with independent integrity. If one floods, the others could remain sealed. So we'd need to re-enter through compartment 7, then access the emergency tunnel to reach compartment 5. Nathan traced the path with his finger. "Then 2 people simultaneously activate the shutdown sequence in both compartments, while the whole structure is destabilizing around them," Frank added grimly. "The odds aren't good, Nathan. Better than letting that thing blow and wipe out the entire town." A tense silence followed, broken only by the crash of waves and the distant rumble of thunder. The blue glow in the water pulsed more rapidly now, the waves it generated growing larger with each cycle. "I'll go," Nathan said finally, his voice firm with resolve. "I'll take the jeep and access compartment 7 again." "You'll need a partner for compartment 5, James said, stepping forward. "I understand the technology better than anyone here. It should be me." "No." Nathan's rejection was immediate and absolute. "You're not trained for this kind of dive, especially not in these conditions." "I was Navy too, Dad. 4 years as a combat engineer before Annapolis. I'm qualified." Nathan stared at his son, momentarily speechless. James had never mentioned military service. Another gulf between them. Another conversation they'd never had during the strained, infrequent phone calls that constituted their relationship since Margaret's death. "I'll go with Nathan," Frank insisted. "I've got the experience, and I already know the layout." "With all due respect, Mr. Sullivan," James countered, "you're 72 years old with one leg. This requires someone who can move quickly through flooded tunnels if necessary." Frank bristled, but before he could respond, a new voice joined the conversation. "I'll go." They turned to find Sarah standing behind them, her face set with determination. "I'm an experienced diver. I've already been inside once, and I've got a personal stake in this." She held up the file containing the details of her father's death. "Besides, I'm the smallest person here. If we're navigating tight emergency tunnels, that matters." Nathan started to object, but the logic was sound. Every minute they delayed increased the risk of catastrophic failure. And there was something in Sarah's expression, a need for resolution, for redemption of her father's death, that silenced his protest. All right, he conceded. Sarah and I will make the dive. The response team will be here in 30 minutes, Williams informed them, rejoining the group. They're bringing specialized equipment to handle the situation. That's 20 minutes too late, Nathan replied, already moving toward the diving gear they'd discarded on the beach. By then, half the eastern seaboard could be underwater. Williams looked like he wanted to object, but instead nodded grimly. What do you need? Fresh air tanks, Sarah said, checking their equipment. Ours are nearly depleted. I've got spares in my truck, Frank offered, and underwater lights. You'll need them if the reactor's power fluctuates. We should alert the town, Donovan suggested. Start evacuating people inland, just in case. No, Williams countered. That would create panic, clog the roads, potentially cause more casualties than the event itself. If they succeed, evacuation is unnecessary. If they fail, he left the thought unfinished. They worked quickly, preparing the diving equipment while James and Eleanor studied the shutdown procedure, memorizing the steps and contingencies. The blue glow continued to intensify, now visible even through the rain-lashed surface of the water. The procedure is straightforward, James explained as he helped Nathan into his gear. Each compartment has a control console with a shutdown interface. You'll need to enter a specific sequence of commands, then turn 3 physical keys in a precise order. The keys are stored in a security box in each compartment. And we have to do this simultaneously, Sarah confirmed, securing her tank. Within a 30-second window, the system will provide countdown indicators once the sequence is initiated. How will we communicate between compartments? Nathan asked. Eleanor held up a diagram. There's an internal communication system, hardwired intercoms between the compartments. If they're still functional after all these years. And if they're not, Sarah pressed, then timing will be critical, James said. You'll need to synchronize your watches and execute the sequence at precisely the agreed time. Frank approached with additional equipment, underwater flashlights, a specialized toolkit, in a small waterproof case. Contingency, he said, handing the case to Nathan. If all else fails. Nathan opened it to find a small explosive charge with a timer. His eyes met Frank's, understanding passing between them without words. A last resort, if the shutdown failed, an attempt to direct the energy release away from the shoreline. 20 minutes, Frank instructed, tapping the timer. That's how long you have got after arming it. Should be enough time to get clear if things go south. Nathan secured the case to his belt, hoping they wouldn't need it. As they completed their preparations, the sound of vehicles approaching drew their attention to the road above. 2 black SUVs had arrived, followed by a larger truck with government markings. That'll be the response team, Williams said. I'll deal with them, buy you some time. The rest of you should clear the area, give these 2 space to work. I'm staying, James insisted. I can talk them through the procedure via radio if needed. Me too, Frank added, his tone brooking no argument. Eleanor squeezed Nathan's arm. Be careful, both of you. She turned to Sarah. Your father would be proud. Sarah's expression softened momentarily. Thank you. As Eleanor and Donovan headed up to the road to help Williams stall the government team, Nathan and Sarah finished their equipment checks. The plan was simple but dangerous. Re-enter the flooded bunker, navigate to their respective compartments, and execute the shutdown procedure simultaneously. If successful, the reactor would stabilize, preventing catastrophic energy release. If they failed, the explosive charge might at least direct the worst of the blast away from the populated coastline. Ready? Nathan asked, securing his mask. Sarah nodded, her eyes betraying a mixture of fear and resolve. For my father. For all of us, Nathan replied. They waded into the churning surf, the blue glow enveloping them as they submerged. The water felt different now, charged with an energy that made the hairs on Nathan's arms stand up even through his wetsuit. The visibility was poor, the combination of storm-stirred sediment and the pulsing blue light creating a disorienting environment. They followed the chain down, its massive links now vibrating slightly with the energy emanating from below. The underwater passage through the rock face seemed even narrower than before, the surrounding stone trembling with microseismic activity. When they emerged into the chamber containing the bunker, the change was immediately apparent. The structure had shifted, one side partially collapsed, revealing interior sections that had previously been hidden. The outer hatch they had opened earlier was now damaged, jammed permanently open, allowing seawater to flood the entry corridor. They swam through, navigating the flooded passage until they reached the airlock. As they had hoped, the inner hatch remained sealed, suggesting that the compartments beyond might still be intact. Nathan worked the manual override, forcing the mechanism to disengage despite the pressure differential. The hatch swung open with unexpected force, nearly crushing them against the wall. Beyond lay not the dry corridor they had traversed earlier, but a partially flooded tunnel. The water level had risen to about chest height, leaving an air pocket in the upper portion of the passage. They surfaced, removing their masks to preserve air supply while maintaining their regulators in reach. "The flooding's worse than we thought," Nathan observed, his voice echoing in the confined space. "We need to move quickly before it completely fills these corridors." The blue lighting strips along the walls flickered erratically, plunging them into momentary darkness before flaring back to life with increased intensity. The entire structure groaned around them, metal and concrete protesting against forces they were never designed to withstand. They waded through the chest-deep water to the junction where the corridor branched toward compartments 5, 6, and 7. The passage to compartment 7 was fully flooded now, water spilling from it to increase the level in the main corridor. "That's your route," Sarah said, pointing to the flooded passage. "I'll take compartment 5. Nathan checked his watch, synchronizing it with Sarah's. 15 minutes from now. That's when we execute the shutdown, regardless of what happens. If the intercoms don't work, stick to the timetable." Sarah nodded, then surprised him by quickly embracing him. "Thank you for helping me find the truth about my father." Before he could respond, she was moving toward compartment 5, wading through the rising water with determined strides. Nathan watched her go, then turned to face his own challenge, the fully flooded passage to compartment 7. He replaced his mask and regulator, then submerged, swimming into the corridor with powerful kicks. His dive light illuminated the way ahead, revealing that the passage had suffered structural damage. Portions of the ceiling had collapsed, creating obstacles he had to navigate around. The blue light from the reactor pulsed through the water, growing more intense as he approached compartment 7. When he finally reached the compartment, he found it dramatically changed from their earlier visit. The central reactor cylinder was now enveloped in a sphere of intensely bright blue energy, like ball lightning underwater. The control panels around the perimeter sparked and sizzled as seawater made contact with live electrical components. Nathan located the shutdown console on the far side of the chamber. Swimming carefully to avoid the energy discharge from the reactor, he reached the panel and examined it. The interface was remarkably simple: a keypad for entering the command sequence, and a security box containing the physical keys required for shutdown. He checked his watch, 7 minutes until the synchronized shutdown attempt. Enough time to prepare the sequence and locate the keys. The security box was locked, but the mechanism was old and corroded. Nathan used one of the tools Frank had provided, working methodically to disengage the lock without damaging the contents. After several tense minutes, the box opened, revealing 3 brass keys, each labeled with a different symbol that matched markings on the control panel. He removed the keys carefully, arranging them in the order specified in the procedure. Then he turned his attention to the keypad. The shutdown sequence was a specific pattern of numbers: 7, 3, 1, 4, 5, 9, 2, 6, 8, 0, corresponding to a mathematical constant described in the Poseidon documentation. With the preparations complete, Nathan checked the intercom system, pressing the button labeled Comp 5. To his surprise, a burst of static was followed by Sarah's voice, distorted but audible. "Nathan, can you hear me?" "I hear you," he replied, relief evident in his tone. "I'm ready at the control panel. How's your situation?" "Compartments intact, minimal flooding. I've found the console and the keys, ready when you are." Synchronized watches. We execute at exactly 2:47 p.m. Confirmed, 2:47. Nathan checked his watch, less than 2 minutes remaining. He positioned himself at the console, keys in hand, mental rehearsing the sequence one final time. As the seconds ticked down, the reactor's pulsing accelerated, the sphere of energy expanding and contracting like a beating heart. The water around him seemed to vibrate with potential energy, molecules excited to a state just short of transition. At precisely 2:47, Nathan began the sequence, entering the numerical code with deliberate keystrokes. The console responded with a series of lights, each illuminating as the correct digit was entered. When the full sequence was complete, a countdown appeared on the small display. 30 seconds. Sequence initiated, he reported via the intercom. Beginning key rotation on my mark. Now. He inserted the first key into its designated slot and turned it clockwise until it clicked into position. The reactor's pulsing faltered momentarily, then resumed at a slightly slower pace. First key engaged, Sarah's voice confirmed through the intercom. Proceeding to second. Nathan inserted the second key, this one requiring a counterclockwise rotation followed by a quarter turn back. The energy sphere surrounding the reactor contracted slightly, its color shifting from electric blue toward a deeper indigo. Second key engaged. Final key on my mark. 3, 2, 1. Now. The third key turned smoothly, locking into place with a satisfying click. The countdown on the display reached 0, and for a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like a massive bell being struck, the reactor's pulsing stopped entirely. The sphere of energy collapsed inward, compressing to a tight ball of intense light before stabilizing at about half its previous size. Shutdown sequence complete, Sarah reported, her voice steady despite the tension. Reactor status? Stabilizing, Nathan confirmed, watching as the monitoring equipment registered decreasing energy outputs. We did it. The containment field is reestablishing. The relief was short-lived. A violent tremor shook the compartment, dislodging equipment from the walls and sending debris crashing into the water. The reactor's energy sphere pulsed once, violently, then resumed its previous pattern of expansion and contraction. Nathan? Sarah's voice was edged with alarm. Something's happening. The floor in compartment 5 just buckled. Structural integrity is failing. Another tremor, stronger than the first, rocked the facility. Nathan grabbed the console to steady himself, watching in dismay as the reactor's energy field began to pulse more rapidly again. The shutdown sequence didn't work, he realized. Or not completely. The reactor's too far gone for the original protocols to contain it. What's our backup plan? Nathan's hand moved to the waterproof case at his belt. Frank's contingency. The explosive charge properly placed might direct the energy release away from the shore, minimizing the impact on Stormhaven. I'm going to try something, he told Sarah. Get out now. Return to the surface. Tell them the shutdown failed. What are you going to do? What has to be done? Nathan's voice was calm, resolved. Go, Sarah. Don't argue. You found your truth. Now make sure the world hears it. There was a moment of silence, then. Your grandfather would be proud, Nathan. So would your son. The intercom went silent. Nathan hoped she was already making her way back to the surface, to safety. Now it was his turn to complete the mission. The explosive charge was small but powerful, designed for underwater demolition. With the right placement, it could breach the outer wall of the bunker facing away from shore, allowing the energy to discharge into the deep ocean rather than toward land. Nathan swam to the exterior wall, examining it for the optimal placement point. The structure's blueprints had shown a potential weak spot where two prefabricated sections joined together. If he could locate that seam, there, a slightly different pattern in the concrete, a line running vertically from floor to ceiling. Nathan placed the charge against this seam, activating the magnetic clamp to secure it in place. Then he set the timer for 20 minutes, enough time for Sarah to reach the surface and for evacuation efforts to begin, but not so long that the reactor would reach critical instability. As he worked, the energy sphere continued its ominous pulsing, each cycle bringing it closer to the point of uncontrolled release. The water around him had become uncomfortably warm, the electrical charge within it making his skin a tingle even through the wetsuit. With the charge set, Nathan took one final look at the reactor, the technological marvel that had remained hidden for nearly 8 decades, that could have changed the course of human development if it hadn't been buried beneath the waves by fear and political calculation. His grandfather had been right to leave clues, to ensure that someday the truth would emerge. Perhaps now, with the documentation they had recovered, The world would finally benefit from the knowledge that had been kept secret for so long. Even if the original reactor was lost, its legacy might live on through James and others who could rebuild the technology with modern safety protocols. Nathan turned to leave, then paused as his dive light illuminated something he hadn't noticed before. 4. A small metal box secured to the wall near the exit, labeled Emergency Override. It hadn't been mentioned in the shutdown procedures they'd found. Curious, he approached the box and opened it. Inside was a single red button protected by a clear cover, with instructions etched into the metal beneath. Final Containment Protocol, Irreversible Reactor Dormancy. A last-ditch emergency measure, perhaps? Something not documented in the regular procedures because it rendered the reactor permanently inoperable? Nathan checked his watch. 18 minutes remained on the explosive timer, enough time to try this mysterious override before evacuating. He lifted the protective cover and pressed the red button firmly. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Panels around the base of the reactor slid open, revealing mechanisms that had remained hidden until now. Metal arms extended from these openings, converging on the energy sphere with mechanical precision. As they made contact with the pulsing energy, they began to draw it inward, containing and compressing it with increasing efficiency. The reactor's control panel lit up with new information, displaying a progress bar labeled Energy Absorption and Neutralization. The percentage climbed steadily, 10%, 25%, 40%. Nathan watched in fascination as the system he had unwittingly activated systematically dismantled the energy field, converting its potential back into a stable, contained form. The tremors subsided, the water temperature began to normalize, and the ominous pulsing slowed and eventually ceased altogether. By the time the progress bar reached 100%, the reactor had transformed. The energy sphere was gone, replaced by a solid crystalline structure that glowed with a soft, steady blue light. The monitoring equipment indicated zero energy emission, complete dormancy, just as the override label had promised. Nathan realized what he had done. The emergency override hadn't just shut down the reactor, it had fundamentally altered its configuration, rendering it inert while preserving its structure. The technology was now safe but unusable, a museum piece rather than a functioning power source. He quickly deactivated the explosive charge, removing it from the wall and securing it back in its case. Then, with a final glance at the dormant reactor, he began his journey back through the flooded corridors toward the surface. The return trip was easier than expected. The structural tremors had ceased, and the water pressure had equalized throughout the facility, eliminating the dangerous currents that had impeded their earlier escape. When Nathan emerged from the underwater passage into the open sea, he was surprised to find the blue glow completely gone, replaced by the natural green-gray of the Atlantic in storm conditions. He surfaced about 50 yards from shore, where a crowd had gathered despite the continuing rain. Emergency vehicles lined the beach, their lights flashing in the gloom. As he swam toward land, he saw Sarah standing with James and Frank, all three watching the water with anxious expressions. James was the first to spot him, pointing and shouting something Nathan couldn't hear over the crash of the waves. Then they were all moving toward the water's edge, Frank hobbling determinedly across the wet sand despite his prosthetic leg. Nathan's feet finally touched bottom, and he stood, removing his mask and waving to indicate success. The relief on their faces was visible even from a distance. He waded the rest of the way to shore, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was, how his muscles ached from the physical demands of the past hours. James reached him first, supporting him as he stumbled onto the beach. "Dad, what happened?" Sarah said the shutdown sequence failed. "It did," Nathan confirmed, removing his tank and letting it drop to the sand. "But I found an emergency override, some kind of last resort protocol. It worked. The reactor's dormant now, permanently." Frank arrived, his face a mixture of disbelief and pride. "You crazy son of a bitch, you actually did it." "We did it," Nathan corrected, looking past him to where Sarah stood, camera in hand, documenting the moment. "All of us." Senator Williams approached, accompanied by a team of men in specialized hazmat diving gear. The government response team arrived too late to be needed. "The energy signature has disappeared completely," Williams informed them, holding up a handheld monitoring device. Whatever you did down there, it worked. The technology's safe now, Nathan told him, but it's also inactive. The override protocol was designed to render the reactor permanently dormant. Williams nodded, unsurprised. A fail-safe built into the original design. If the technology couldn't be controlled, it would be neutralized. He glanced toward the water. My team will still need to secure the site, recover whatever remains for proper study and disposal. They're welcome to it, Nathan said wearily, but the documentation we recovered, that's a different matter. I've already spoken with the senator about that, Eleanor interjected, joining their group. She held up a waterproof bag containing copies of the materials they had salvaged. These records are of immense historical significance. They belong in the National Archives, not some classified storage facility. William sighed, looking suddenly tired. I've been authorized to negotiate terms. The technical specifications of the reactor itself will remain classified, but the historical context, the details of Operation Poseidon, the personnel records, those can be released after appropriate review. And my father's case, Sarah pressed, stepping forward, will be officially acknowledged and compensated, Williams assured her. It's the least we can do. As the various agencies began their work, securing the beach, preparing dive teams to assess the underwater facility, establishing a perimeter to keep curious onlookers at bay, Nathan found himself standing apart, watching the activity with a strange sense of detachment. Frank joined him, offering a thermos of hot coffee. Penny for your thoughts. Nathan accepted the thermos gratefully, letting the warmth seep into his cold hands. Thinking about my grandfather, about the burden he carried all those years, knowing what was down there, what it could have meant for the world. He did what he could, Frank observed, left the breadcrumbs for someone to follow when the time was right. And now it's too late. The technology's lost. Is it? Frank nodded toward where James stood deep in conversation with Eleanor and Senator Williams, examining diagrams from the recovered documentation. Your boy understands more of this than you think, and he's got the resources to do something with it. Nathan watched his son, really looked at him for the first time in years, saw the confidence in his bearing, the intelligence in his eyes, the sense of purpose that reminded Nathan of Margaret. James had forged his own path, found his own way to make a difference in the world. Perhaps he had been more attentive than Nathan had given him credit for. You know, Frank continued, your grandfather would be damn proud of what happened here today. Not just because you saved the town, but because you finished what he started. You brought the truth to light. We brought it to light, Nathan corrected him. All of us. Sheriff Donovan approached, looking official but speaking casually. Just got word from town. Those government types confiscated Sarah's camera equipment from her office while we were out here. Didn't find anything, though. Of course they didn't, Frank said with a sly smile. The girl's smarter than that. Bet she had the files uploaded to a secure server before she even came back to shore. Donovan's expression confirmed this assessment. Truth has a way of surfacing, just like that chain. Sometimes it just needs a storm to uncover it. As if on Keku, the clouds began to break. Sunlight spearing through in bright shafts that transformed the raindrops into momentary diamonds. The storm was passing, moving out to sea, where it would eventually dissipate, its energy spent. Nathan looked out at the water, now calm and ordinary, giving no indication of the extraordinary secret it had held for nearly 8 decades. The chain that had led them to that secret was mostly submerged again, only a few links visible above the receding tide. But the truth it had anchored was finally free, rising to the surface after generations of enforced silence. Like his grandfather before him, Nathan had been part of that truth's journey, not bearing it this time, but helping it emerge into the light where it belonged. And in that emergence, perhaps there was hope. Hope that humanity had evolved enough to use such knowledge wisely, to harness revolutionary technology for the betterment of all, rather than the enrichment of a few. Hope that the lessons of the past could guide the decisions of the future. The chains of secrecy had been broken. What would be built in their place remained to be seen. But for the first time in a long while, Nathan found himself looking forward to that future, and to his place in helping shape it, alongside his son and the unlikely allies this adventure had brought into his life. The sea had given up one of its oldest secrets. Now it was up to them to honor that gift by ensuring it served the purpose John Hayes had always believed it should, illuminating the path toward a better world, like a beacon cutting through the darkness of a storm-tossed night.